So here in new task, I also want to use my custom hook. And therefore, first of all, we should import use HTTP from hooks use HTTP. Then we can call use HTTP, and we no longer need to pass in any parameters because of the refactoring work we did in the last lecture. Now we still get back an object though, which we can destructure, where we get access to isLoading, to the error, and to send request. And here I will rename send request to send task request. But that, of course, is up to you. We can get rid of the two states here now and of the use state import, therefore, because we're using our custom hook for this now. Now, in the enter task handler, we in the end want to call send task request now. We want to call that here because we want to send that request whenever enter task handler is triggered, which happens when that form was submitted in the end. Therefore, we will soon delete all that code, but before we do that, we need to ensure that we pass the proper configuration and data handling function to send request. And for this, let's start with the config object. I pass in a new object where the URL is set to this URL. And here now, since I want to set a post request, I'll also set the method to post. And I'll set the headers here to the headers object, which I got down there, like this. And I will, of course, also add a body, however, not as JSON, because we're doing that JSON transformation inside of the custom hook here. But instead, I will therefore just send in this object here, which I previously changed to JSON in the new task component. So that's my request config object now. The second argument is a function which takes the response data and does something with it. And the something I want to do with it is in the end this down here. I want to extract the generated ID, which Firebase gives me automatically. I want to create a task object which incorporates that ID, and I then want to call props on add task. So we could either create this function on the fly here, or we create it in advance, like this here, the create task function, let's say. And here I get my data, my task data as an argument. And then we grab this logic from down there, this logic, copy that, and add this here in create task. And data is now renamed to task data like this. And we now use create task to pass this as a second argument here to send task request. We don't need to work with use callback or anything like this here, because we are only calling send task request in the enter task handler, not inside of use effect or anything like that. Therefore, here we won't have the problem of an infinite loop, because this request will not be sent whenever the component is re-evaluated, but only when this function runs, which happens when the form is submitted. That was different in the app component. There we sent the request inside of use effect, and therefore we had the danger of sending the request too often. In new task, we should be fine now. And therefore we can grab this old code here and get rid of all of that, so that inside of the enter task handler, I'm now only calling send task request, and we're configuring it like this. Now in my create task function, I'm missing the task text though. That's a problem. I'm missing the text which was, passed from the form to that HTTP request. We do have that text available here inside of enter task handler. To make it available inside of this create task function, which we pass to send task request, we got two main options. We could either grab this function and define it here inside of enter task handler to have a nested function inside of a nested function inside of the component function, and that would work. due to how JavaScript scoping works, we now do have access to the entered task text. Or alternatively, we leave it like this to avoid this deep nesting, and we instead expect to get the task text as an argument here, as a parameter in create task text. And therefore we want two parameters here when actually our custom hook, which is calling create task in the end, only passes in one parameter. It only passes in data. To work around that, we could use the bind method in JavaScript. We could call bind here on create task when we pass it to send task request. And the bind method allows us to pre-configure a function. It does not execute the function right away. Instead, it's a default JavaScript method, which you can use on any function object to pre-configure that function. The first argument you pass to bind then allows you to set the this keyword in the to be executed function, which does not matter to us here, hence we can set this to null. But the second argument you pass to bind will then be the first argument received by that to be called function. So if we want to pass in the task text here, we can set this to task text here, because that will then refer to the task text we're getting from the form submission. Now, the other argument, task data, will still be received here, because this is our pre-configuration. Any other arguments which might be passed by the place where the function is then actually being called, which happens in use HTTP, will then simply be appended to the end of the parameter list. So the data, which we pass here as the only argument to apply data in the custom hook, will be appended as a second argument on create task because of us calling bind here. So when it's being called, this receives all the data which is needed. And this is all just regular JavaScript. This has nothing to do with React or with hooks or anything like that. That's just regular JavaScript. You can learn more about the bind method and about pre-configuring functions with a resource which you find attached to this lecture. And therefore now, if I save this, we can reload and still load all tasks. But if I now send another task, if I click add task, we see sending here. And then we see, does this work? So if I reload, it's also still there. We can also see all that data on Firebase. Now, if I open the console, I also got no errors there. And if we go to the network tab, we also see that indeed we are not sending an infinite amount of requests or anything like that. Instead, if I clear this and I test this, we are in the end just sending one request. It looks like two, but this is just a side request which is sent along the way. And therefore, this is all looking good. And that is how we can build a custom hook for sending HTTP requests. It definitely had its tricky parts, but with it, we now have this custom hook which outsources or which holds a lot of the duplicate logic, especially all that stateful logic, and we can use it in different components to send different kinds of requests and do different kinds of things with the response data and still utilize this shared loading and error state and this shared logic.